Sometimes the smallest bell in a forgotten town rings loud enough for heaven to hear. By the time Ethan Walker saw the copper lantern, the rain had already turned the streets of Ashford, Vermont, into dark ribbons of water and reflected porch light. It was late November, the kind of cold, wet evening that crept through denim, settled into old bones, and made every window look warmer than it really was. His gray pickup rolled slowly down Main Street, tires hissing through puddles, the windshield wipers dragging back and forth with a tired rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. Beside him, Ranger sat upright on the passenger seat, a 6-year-old German shepherd with silver and tan fur darkened by the damp air, ears high, amber eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if he had been waiting for this town long before Ethan arrived. Ethan had no plan to stop. He had $18 in his wallet, half a tank of gas, and a wool blanket folded behind the seat where he usually slept when the nights grew too sharp. At 40 years old, broad-shouldered and quiet, with a square white face roughened by stubble and weather, he carried himself like a man who had learned to take up as little room in the world as possible. The army watch on his wrist had stopped twice over the years, but he still wore it, not because it kept perfect time, but because some things stayed with a man after everything else had been taken. Then Ranger made a sound low in his chest, not a bark, not fear, but the kind of warning Ethan had learned never to ignore. The dog leaned toward the passenger window, nose almost touching the glass. Ahead, at the far end of Main Street, an old tavern stood under a sagging roof, its sign swinging on one rusted chain. The copper lantern, painted in faded gold letters, groaned beneath the rain. A real copper lantern hung above the porch, green with age, rocking gently though the air had gone strangely still. Ethan slowed the truck. The lantern moved once, twice, then rang with a thin, trembling note. Ranger's ears snapped forward. At that exact moment, a dull crack came from inside the tavern, followed by the muffled sound of a man calling out. Ethan pulled to the curb without thinking. He stepped into the rain, boots splashing through cold water, Ranger landing beside him with a heavy, graceful thud. The tavern door was swollen from years of weather, but Ethan forced it open with his shoulder. Warmth did not greet him. Only the smell of wet wood, dust, old smoke, and something faintly sweet, like spilled cider dried into the floorboards decades ago. Near the center of the room, beneath a broken ceiling beam, an old man sat trapped against the edge of an overturned table, one hand gripping the chair beside him, his breath shallow but steady. He was thin, white-haired, and dressed in a plaid shirt buttoned wrong at the collar, his face lined by years of work and loneliness. Ethan crossed the room with the calm speed of a man who had handled worse storms than this one. "Easy, sir," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've got you." Ranger moved to the old man's side and lay down close, pressing his warm body against the man's leg as if offering the one thing no rain could wash away. The old man blinked at the dog, then at Ethan, his eyes wet from pain or wonder, maybe both. Above them, the copper lantern outside rang again, soft and clear, though no wind touched the door. Ethan did not ask the old man how long he had been trapped, because some questions stole breath from people who needed to save it. He only studied the room, the beam, the angle of the overturned table, and the slow drip of rainwater falling through the ceiling into a brass spittoon that caught each drop with a hollow ping. The tavern was dim, lit only by a few stubborn bulbs above the bar and the gray wash of stormlight pressing against the windows. Every surface seemed to carry a memory. Cracked leather stools, framed photographs clouded by age, a row of dusty glasses turned upside down like small bells waiting for a hand to wake them. Ethan set his shoulder beneath the lighter end of the beam and tested its weight. It groaned, but it moved half an inch. Ranger lifted his head, watching him with the focus of a soldier awaiting a signal. "Stay with him," Ethan said, and the dog settled again against the old man, steady and warm. The man tried to speak, but Ethan shook his head gently. "Save it. We will talk when you are standing." He found a floor jack near the back wall, old but usable, its red paint chipped down to bare metal. Beside it leaned 3 2x4s, warped from damp but still strong enough for a brace. His hands moved with quiet precision, measuring without a tape, listening to the strain in the wood the way another man might listen to music. For a moment, The years between his old life and this one disappeared. There was only weight, balance, breath, and the need to keep one more person safe until the storm passed. He placed the jack, wedged the boards, and lifted slowly. The beam rose another inch, then two. The old man pulled in a sharper breath. Ranger whined softly, not in fear, but in encouragement, his amber eyes never leaving Ethan. "All right," Ethan murmured. "On three, slide toward me. 1, 2, 3. The old man moved with surprising strength, enough for Ethan to catch him under the arms and ease him away from the table. They both sank onto the worn floorboards near the fireplace, where a pile of cold ash still smelled faintly of last winter. For several seconds, the only sound was rain tapping the roof and the strange, soft ringing of the copper lantern beyond the door. The old man looked at Ethan as if trying to place him in a memory he had not yet lived. "Name is Walter Briggs," he whispered at last. "This place is mine, though I suppose it has been trying to leave me for years." Ethan glanced at the sagging ceiling, the water-stained walls, the bar polished smooth by generations of elbows and sorrow. "Places do not leave," he said quietly. "People just get too tired to hold them up alone." Walter's eyes shifted to Ranger, who rested his chin on the man's knee with solemn patience. A faint smile crossed the old man's face, fragile but real. "That dog knew before you did." Ethan looked toward the doorway, where the lantern had gone still again. Outside, the storm folded Ashford into darkness, but inside the ruined tavern, something small had changed. Not repaired yet, not saved, but noticed. And sometimes being noticed is the first mercy a broken thing receives. Walter Briggs insisted he could stand, but when he tried, his knees trembled beneath him like old porch rails in a hard wind. Ethan helped him into a booth near the front window, the one with a torn red cushion and a view of Main Street shining under the rain. Ranger followed close, nails clicking softly across the floorboards, then settled beneath the table with his head angled toward Walter's boots. The old man watched him for a long moment, breathing more evenly now, one hand resting against his ribs, the other curled around the edge of the table as if the tavern might drift away if he let go. Ethan found a kettle in the kitchen, rinsed 2 mugs, and lit the small gas burner after checking the line twice. The kitchen was narrow and tired, but not dirty. It had the look of a place once loved by careful hands. Copper pans hung above the stove, dull but orderly. A blue apron still rested on a hook by the pantry door, faded at the hem, with the name Margaret stitched in white thread across the pocket. Ethan noticed it, then looked away, because grief had a way of filling rooms even when nobody spoke its name. He brought Walter hot tea sweetened with honey from a jar that had nearly crystallized. Walter wrapped both hands around the mug and gave a small nod of thanks. "My wife used to make coffee strong enough to wake the dead," he said, his voice rough, but warmer now. But tea was what she gave people when the world had been unkind to them. Ethan sat across from him, rainwater dripping from the ends of his dark jacket onto the floor. "She ran this place with you?" Walter looked toward the bar, where old photographs lined the wall in uneven rows. "She was this place. I only own the deed." He pointed with 2 fingers, and Ethan followed the gesture. There were pictures of fishermen holding up trout, railroad workers in soot-stained caps, a Little League team from 1987, firefighters after a flood, and men in uniform standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a banner that read "Welcome Home." Some smiled with their whole faces. Some smiled as if they were still remembering how. "Every Friday night," Walter said, Margaret kept that back table open for anyone who had nowhere else to sit. Truckers, widowers, boys back from overseas, women passing through with children asleep in the car. She said a tavern ought to be more than a place where people spend money. It ought to be a place where a lonely person can hear his own name spoken kindly. Ethan lowered his eyes to the table. The words landed somewhere deep, in a part of him he usually kept packed away with the spare blanket behind his seat. Ranger shifted beneath the booth and gave one soft breath, as if he had heard it too. Walter studied Ethan's worn sleeves, the stopped army watch, the tired line of his shoulders. He did not ask where Ethan lived. Mercy, the old man seemed to understand, sometimes began by not forcing a man to explain his emptiness. Outside, the rain softened. The copper lantern above the porch gave one quiet chime, though the street had gone still again. Walter's face changed when he heard it. Not fear, Recognition. He looked toward the ceiling, then toward the long bar where the shadows gathered deepest. That lantern has not rung like that since Margaret passed, he whispered. Ranger lifted his head at once, ears forward, eyes fixed on the floor behind the bar. Ethan followed the dog's stare, and for the first time since entering the copper lantern, he felt the tavern was not merely old. It was waiting. For a while, no one moved. The old tavern held its breath around them, all damp wood, dim glass, and the faint sweetness of honey rising from Walter's mug. Ethan watched Ranger stand from beneath the booth and walk toward the bar with a careful, deliberate pace. The German shepherd did not hurry. He moved as if following a sound too thin for human ears, his nose low, his shoulders steady, his tail still. When he reached the worn oak counter, he stopped at a section of floor where the boards were darker than the rest, polished by decades of boots, spilled coffee, and late-night sorrow. Then he placed one paw gently on the wood. Walter drew in a trembling breath. Margaret used to stand there, he said. Ethan glanced back at him. The old man's eyes had softened, but there was something else in them now, a memory waking after a long sleep. Every winter, Walter continued, she would hear things before I did. A car outside in the snow. A tired knock on the door. Someone crying in the alley after closing. I used to tell her she had ears like a church bell. She would just smile and say the lonely make a sound only the heart can hear. Ethan knelt beside Ranger and ran his fingers over the floorboards. They were solid, but one plank sat a fraction higher near the edge, its nailheads dark with age. He pressed down. The board gave a faint click. From somewhere below, a soft metallic answer rose through the wood, so gentle it might have been imagined if Ranger had not lifted both ears at once. Walter gripped the table. What was that? Ethan did not answer right away. He reached into his coat pocket, took out a small folding knife he used more for rope and cans than anything else, and eased the tip into the seam. Could be old plumbing, he said, though his voice carried little belief. Could be the building settling. Walter looked toward the copper lantern beyond the window. Or it could be her. Ethan paused, not because the words frightened him, but because of the way Walter said them, not like a man chasing ghosts, but like a man recognizing mercy in a language he had almost forgotten. The plank lifted with a long sigh of dust. Beneath it lay a narrow space lined with old tin, dry despite the leaking roof. Inside was a small brass key, a folded envelope sealed with yellowed wax, and a strip of blue ribbon faded almost gray. Walter's face changed the moment he saw the ribbon. That was from her apron, he whispered. Ethan lifted the envelope carefully and handed it to him. The handwriting across the front was graceful, faded, and unmistakably patient. Walter Briggs, when the lantern rings again. The old man held it as if it were warm. For nearly a minute, he could not open it. Rain whispered along the windows. Ranger sat beside the exposed floor, calm now, his work finished for the moment. At last Walter broke the seal with shaking fingers. The paper inside unfolded softly, carrying the faint scent of cedar and thyme. Ethan looked away to give him privacy, but Walter read aloud in a voice so thin it seemed to travel from another season. My dearest Walter, if this letter has found you, then someone kind has entered this place when you needed him most. Do not send him away. The Lord sometimes answers loneliness with footsteps on a rainy night. The room went very still. Ethan felt those words settle over his wet shoulders, heavier than his coat, gentler than a blanket. Walter lowered the letter and looked at him, tears bright but quiet in his eyes. Behind the bar, beneath the open floor, the hidden metal gave one more delicate ring, like a small bell saying amen. Walter read the first line again, slower this time, as if the paper had become a doorway and he was afraid of stepping through too quickly. Ethan remained near the open floorboard, one hand resting on Ranger's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dogs breathing beneath his palm. The storm outside had weakened to a silver drizzle, but the tavern still answered it in small sounds, drops tapping into buckets, wind touching the loose sign, old pipes clicking behind the walls like bones warming by a fire. Walter unfolded the second page, and a smaller brass key slipped from between the papers onto the table with a soft clink. It was darker than the first, shaped with an old-fashioned bow, its teeth worn smooth by time. Ranger lifted his head but did not move. He only watched the key, then turned his eyes toward the hallway beside the kitchen. Walter followed the dog's gaze and went pale. "The cellar," he whispered. Ethan helped him stand, but Walter waved off the stronger support after a moment, not from pride, but from the need to face whatever had waited below on his own feet. They moved slowly through the narrow passage behind the bar, past shelves of clean plates, empty flour tins, and the blue apron still hanging by the pantry door. At the end stood a heavy wooden door with a black iron latch. Its paint had cracked into thin veins, and dust lay thick along the threshold. Walter held up the key, his fingers trembling. "I have not opened this since Margaret's service," he said. "Could not bring myself to go down there. Too much of her was in every corner." Ethan did not answer with advice. He only stood beside him, quiet as a fence post in winter, letting the old man take the time grief required. When Walter turned the key, the lock gave way with a tired click. A breath of cool air rose from below, carrying the scent of stone, cedar, and something faintly metallic, not unpleasant, only old. Ethan clicked on the small flashlight from his coat and aimed it down the stairs. They descended one step at a time. Ranger went first, careful and alert, his paws soundless on the worn wood. The cellar opened wider than Ethan expected, with stone walls, low beams, and shelves lined with jars, folded blankets, lantern oil, and boxes labeled in Margaret's handwriting. Winter coats, canned peaches, extra socks. Do not forget the coffee. Walter gave a broken little laugh when he saw that last one, the sound half sorrow, half sunlight. She stocked this place like the whole town might need saving. Ethan moved the beam of light across the room. Against the far wall sat a long table with 12 mismatched chairs. Above it hung a faded sign painted by hand. "No one eats alone here." The words struck him harder than he expected. He thought of nights spent in the truck, eating crackers in parking lots while warm restaurants glowed across the street. He thought of men he had known who could walk through crowded rooms and still feel unseen. Ranger suddenly stopped beside a stack of old apple crates. His ears tilted forward. Then came the sound again. 3 faint chimes from somewhere beyond the stone wall, softer than memory, clearer than rain. Ethan crouched and brushed dust from the mortar. Hidden behind one crate was a narrow iron plate set into the wall, and in its center was a keyhole that matched the smaller brass key in Walter's hand. Walter looked at Ethan, then at Ranger, and something like hope moved across his tired face. "She kept one more door," he said quietly. Walter did not put the key into the iron plate right away. He stood before it with his shoulders slightly bowed, listening to the faint chime fade behind the wall, and for a moment Ethan saw not a tavern owner, not an old man with dust on his sleeves, but a husband standing at the edge of a promise his wife had kept longer than life itself. The cellar light was thin and gold around them, trembling across jars of peaches, folded blankets, and the hand-painted sign above the table. Ranger sat close to the hidden door, his body calm but alert, his amber eyes fixed on the key in Walter's hand. "She tried to tell me," Walter whispered. "That winter before she passed, she kept saying there was more work for this place to do. I thought she meant repairs. New roof, new pipes, maybe getting the county off my back." He gave a small, aching smile. Margaret always meant something bigger than I understood. Ethan shifted the flashlight toward the iron plate. "You do not have to open it tonight." Walter looked at him then, and his expression softened with gratitude, but he shook his head. "I think I have left it closed long enough." The key slid into the lock with surprising ease. When Walter turned it, something deep in the wall released with a patient click, as gentle as a clock remembering how to move. Ethan braced one hand against the stone and pulled the plate outward. A narrow door opened, hidden so well the seams had vanished beneath paint, dust, and years of ordinary silence. Cool air breathed from the space beyond, dry and clean, carrying cedar, paper, lamp oil, and the faint iron scent of old rails. Ranger stepped forward first, not rushing, only guiding. Ethan followed with the light. Behind the wall was not a vault of glittering treasure, but a small passageway reinforced with timber and stone, running 20 feet beneath the tavern toward the back of the property. Along one side, a narrow metal track disappeared into the darkness, the kind once used to roll supply carts. At the end stood another room, larger than the cellar, sealed away from damp and time. Ethan's flashlight swept over wooden shelves, trunks, filing cabinets, and a work table covered by a white cloth. On the nearest shelf sat dozens of lanterns, each polished, filled, and labeled with a date. Beside them were ledgers tied in twine. Walter opened one with reverent hands. Names filled the pages, hundreds of them, written in Margaret's careful script. Some had notes beside them. Needed supper. Found work at the mill. Sent bus fare to Ohio. Veteran sleeping behind station. Widow with 2 children. Paid doctor bill. Left before sunrise but smiled. Ethan swallowed hard. He had seen records before, supply lists, duty rosters, reports written to prove what had happened. But this was different. This was evidence that kindness had lived here in secret, organized and faithful, without applause. On the far wall, beneath a framed photograph of Margaret standing in the tavern doorway, hung a newer envelope marked for the one who opens this with Walter. Walter turned to Ethan, but his voice failed him. Ranger walked to the work table and gently touched the white cloth with his nose. Ethan lifted it. Underneath sat a metal box, a stack of property deeds, and a leather-bound folder embossed with the words Margaret Briggs Community Trust. Walter put one hand over his mouth. The tavern above them creaked softly in the rain, but down in that hidden room, it felt as if the whole place had finally exhaled. Walter opened the leather-bound folder, as if he were touching something that could still break his heart. The pages inside were crisp, protected by wax sleeves, and each one carried Margaret's steady hand in blue ink. Ethan held the flashlight over the table while Ranger sat near the passage, listening toward the tavern above them where the last of the rain tapped softly on the roof. The first document was a deed to the tavern itself, renewed and protected under a family trust. The second was a survey map of 3 old buildings behind Main Street, a boarded-up boarding house, a narrow brick storefront, and a small cottage near the railroad spur. Ethan recognized the line of the tracks from the hidden passage. They had all been connected once, not for business, but for shelter, a quiet route through winter when the streets were too cold and pride kept desperate people from knocking at the front door. Walter sank slowly into a wooden chair. "She bought them," he whispered. Ethan turned another page. Receipts, bank letters, paid taxes, maintenance notes, all handled quietly over the years. Margaret had not left behind a fortune in the way people imagined fortunes. She had left behind something stranger and sturdier: ownership, protection, a plan. At the back of the folder was a letter addressed to Walter and the stranger the lantern chooses. Ethan tried to hand it to Walter, but the old man shook his head. "Read it, son. I think she meant you to." Ethan hesitated at the word son, not because it offended him, but because it landed gently in a place that had been empty for a long time. He unfolded the page. Margaret's words seemed to fill the hidden room with warmth. "If this door has opened, then kindness has found its way back into the copper lantern. Walter, my love, forgive me for keeping one secret. I knew grief would make you guard the past, but this place was never meant to be a museum of what we lost. It was meant to be a porch light for those still walking in the dark." Ethan paused. His voice had grown rough without permission. Ranger looked up at him, ears relaxed, as if reminding him to keep going. "The properties listed here belong to the Margaret Briggs Community Trust. They are to be used for meals, temporary rooms, winter shelter, and honest work for people who need one hand reaching toward them. If the man reading this helped you before asking what he would receive, then offer him the tavern, not as a prize, but as a purpose. Let him decide whether the lantern keeps burning." Walter bowed his head, and for the first time that night, he cried without trying to hide it. There was no dramatic sound, only a quiet release, like snow sliding from a branch after carrying too much weight. Ethan folded the letter with care. He wanted to say he could not accept, that he was nobody to be trusted with such a thing, that men who slept in trucks did not become keepers of legacies. But before the words came, Ranger stood and walked to him. The dog pressed his head against Ethan's hand, firm and certain. Above them, from somewhere in the tavern, the copper lantern rang once more, clear and soft. Walter lifted his eyes. "She always said the right person would not think he was worthy," he whispered. Ethan looked around at the ledgers, the lanterns, the names of strangers Margaret had remembered when the world had not. For years he had believed his life had narrowed to roads, gas stations, and cold mornings. Now, in a room hidden beneath an old tavern, he felt a door opening inside himself too. Ethan did not answer Walter right away, because the truth was too large to step into quickly. He stood in the hidden room with Margaret's letter in his hand and felt the years of drifting rise inside him like cold water. He thought of parking lots behind grocery stores, of waking before sunrise so no one would notice the fogged windows of his truck, of stretching $17 across 3 days and calling it discipline because the other word hurt too much. He thought of Ranger curled beside him through every hard season, never asking why home kept moving, never doubting that the next road might lead somewhere better. Now an old man was offering him a tavern, 3 buildings, a trust, and a purpose built by a woman who had somehow seen him before she ever knew his name. "I do not know how to run something like this," Ethan said at last. Walter wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand and gave a tired, tender smile. Neither did Margaret when she started. She just knew how to feed one hungry person. Then another after that. The answer stayed with Ethan as they carried the documents upstairs. The storm had passed completely by then, leaving Ashford washed clean beneath the streetlights. The tavern smelled different, not new, not repaired, but awake. Walter placed Margaret's folder on the bar and set both brass keys beside it. Their small shapes caught the low light like 2 pieces of sunrise. Ranger climbed the stairs from the cellar last, paused beneath the front window, and looked out at the quiet street where puddles reflected the copper lantern above the porch. For the first time all night, the lantern did not ring. It simply glowed. Walter moved slowly behind the bar, running his fingertips along the oak as if greeting an old friend. "The county wanted this place closed by Christmas," he said. "Said it was unsafe, unpaid, unnecessary." He looked toward the photographs on the wall, the faces of fishermen, railroad men, firefighters, soldiers, mothers, children, people who had once sat where silence now gathered. Maybe they were right about the building, but they were wrong about the light. Ethan took off his wet coat and laid it across a chair. "Then we fixed the building." Walter turned to him. "We?" Ethan looked down at Ranger, who had already stretched out beneath the bar as though he had chosen his post. A faint breath of a laugh escaped him, rusty from disuse. "He seems to have made up his mind." Walter laughed too, soft and surprised, and for a moment the tavern sounded years younger. They worked until nearly dawn, not on the mystery, not on the legal weight of what had been found, but on simple things. Ethan set buckets beneath leaks, shut off a bad valve, braced the ceiling beam more safely, and cleared broken plaster from the floor. Walter labeled the folder, gathered old tax envelopes, and made notes for a lawyer in Burlington he still trusted. Near 4 in the morning, he heated soup in the kitchen, and they ate at the back table beneath the sign Margaret had painted long ago. "No one eats alone here." Ethan had read those words once in the cellar, but sitting beneath them with warm soup in his hands, they felt less like a sign and more like an invitation. Outside, the first pale line of morning touched Main Street. Ranger rested at Ethan's feet, eyes half closed, ears still listening. Walter looked across the table and slid one of the brass keys toward him. "Not a business," he said quietly. "A lantern. That is what she left. I am asking you to help me keep it burning." Ethan closed his hand around the key. It was small, old, and warm from Walter's palm. He had owned almost nothing for so long that accepting anything felt dangerous. But some gifts do not make a man rich. Some gifts remind him he is still needed. By Christmas Eve, the copper lantern no longer looked like a place waiting to be condemned. It looked like a place remembering why it had been built. Fresh boards held the patched roof steady. Warm light filled the front windows, and the old copper lantern above the porch had been cleaned until its green age shone like quiet wisdom instead of neglect. Ethan had worked every day with Walter beside him, sometimes for 12 hours, sometimes until their hands shook from cold and effort, but never alone. Word had moved through Ashford in the gentle way good news travels in small towns. A retired plumber came by with spare pipe. A schoolteacher brought curtains from her attic. 2 teenagers shoveled the sidewalk without being asked. A widow named Mrs. Callahan donated blankets because Margaret had once kept her family warm through a hard February. By sunset, the tavern smelled of pine, coffee, fresh bread, and old oak warming near the stove. The back table beneath Margaret's sign was full for the first time in years. A truck driver stranded by snow sat beside a young father looking for work. Mrs. Callahan folded napkins near the window. Walter stood behind the bar in a clean flannel shirt, thinner than before but brighter somehow, as if the light in the room had found its way back into his chest. Ethan moved through the tavern quietly, filling cups, carrying bowls of stew, fixing a loose chair leg when it wobbled under a man who apologized too much. Ranger lay beneath the bar, his silver and tan coat glowing in the firelight, lifting his head whenever the door opened, welcoming each stranger as if he had been expecting them. Near 8 o'clock, Walter tapped a spoon gently against a mug. The room quieted. He did not make a grand speech. His voice was soft, but every person leaned in to hear it. "My Margaret believed no one should have to earn kindness before receiving it," he said. "Tonight this place opens again, not as it was, but as she hoped it would become." He turned to Ethan, and in his hand was a small frame holding the deed transfer and the trust papers, signed, witnessed, and blessed by every trembling hope in the room. This man stopped in the rain when he had every reason to keep driving. He helped an old fool stand back up. "So from this night forward, Ethan Walker will carry the copper lantern with me, and after I am gone, he will keep it burning." Ethan wanted to lower his eyes, but Ranger rose and stepped to his side, pressing against his leg with steady certainty. So Ethan accepted the frame with both hands. There was no applause at first, only silence, warm and deep. Then Mrs. Callahan began to clap, and soon the whole tavern followed, not loudly, not like a crowd at a game, but gently, like rain becoming music on a roof. Months passed. Winter softened into mud, mud into clover, and by spring the boarded-up buildings behind Main Street had become clean rooms with quilts, showers, job postings, and a small kitchen where coffee was always ready before sunrise. Walter lived long enough to see the first veteran sleep safely in the upstairs room, the first family eat without counting coins, the first lonely man laugh at the back table beneath Margaret's sign. When he passed peacefully in early summer, the copper lantern rang once at dawn though there was no wind, and Ethan did not question it. He only stood on the porch with Ranger beside him and watched the town wake under a golden sky. Years later, people would say the copper lantern had been saved by repairs, paperwork, and community effort. Ethan knew better. It had been saved by a woman's hidden faith, an old man's willingness to open one more door, a dog who heard what others missed, and a rainy night when a man with no home stopped to help protect someone else's. He had not received a business. He had received a place where broken people could become whole again, and every evening, when he lit the lantern above the porch, he remembered that kindness always returns, sometimes as shelter, sometimes as purpose, and sometimes as the quiet miracle of finally coming home.